Welcome back, everyone, to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am Jesse Collings, joined as always with my co-host, Jason Ounpraseuth. Jason, today we're going to talk about something that I think in an ideal world we would never have to talk about, which is WWE's involvement in Saudi Arabia and the kind of the history of the Saudi Arabia shows, and obviously one coming up on February 19th as they run their 7th show in Saudi Arabia. But before that, how are you doing? Give me something positive that's going on in your life, Jason, that we could talk about.
I would say that I'm having a very decent year in DFS, daily fantasy sports. So I guess, and it's a grind, especially for NBA. All their COVID protocols, they're playing random players. There's a cartoon character, Charlie Brown. You could play. He's on the 76ers. I guess you can play him for $3,000. But it's still a decent year. So I guess there's some good news after that. But yeah, it's been a while since we did a WWE focused episode. It's been like 4 months. We did like a whole NXT episode. We had some WWE adjacent topics like the whole booking a world champion, talking about Big E and all that. But it's been a while since we actually just did a full like WWE focused episode. And hopefully we're not put on some lists out there. Mr. Biden, if you're listening, I'm on your side. I also don't like Joe Manchin. Throw him in the trash. I'm on your side, Mr. Biden, and
Okay.
so I'm always on your back.
Okay, yeah, with so with daily fan, just with the NBA this year, you look at, like you mentioned, Charlie Brown. Like, there's so many. Like, it's one thing for Joe Johnson and some of these people who like people remember coming back into the league. Lance Stevenson is coming back.
Yep.
But then you look at some of these rosters. If you ever look at, sometimes I just go, I'm a nerd, so I sometimes just go on Basketball Reference and look at the team page and just see they're 9th in defensive rating. That's good. I didn't know their defense was that good. And so I was looking at you see every player that has been listed as a rostered member for those teams. And sometimes you start just seeing people and you're like, oh, come on, that person's not real. And so the other day, I don't really know why, but I was looking at the 76ers. I was looking at the Miami Heat roster page, and and I just see someone, this man's name is Haywood Highsmith. And I was like, oh, come on, that can't be a real person. And sure enough, Haywood Highsmith has played 4 games for the Miami Heat. He played at Wheeling University, which would be a D2 school. And I was like, it's just one of those things that's just like, oh my God, this.
They're playing a guy named Kyle Guy.
Yeah.
That's an actual name.
Well, I remember Kyle Guy because he played, I think, at Virginia, when they won the national championship. So I at least know that. It's something about the NBA where, because there's only 12 players on an active roster at any given time, if you're a big enough fan, you kind of can get to a point where you at least have heard of almost everyone.
Yeah.
In the league, you're not gonna say you have a take or know really anything about their game, but if you just follow the NBA closely enough, you'll be like, oh yeah, the 11th man on the Pacers, Goga Batazde. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember him in the draft, and there's little tits of stuff that you get. But with this, so many, with so many people getting signed to 10-day contracts, it's become now you just have no idea who some of these end of the bench people are. And because of, COVID protocols and stuff like that, these people are actually playing. They're not just bench warmers who might only make an appearance in a blowout. It's oh, this person's coming in the second quarter and they're hoping to get 5 minutes out of them. And, it's different in the NFL or at baseball or soccer or something where there's just enough people where you don't know. It's I'm not going to know every single person in the league. So exactly. I don't really, they're bringing in this middle reliever that I've never heard of before. It's one of those funny things. But COVID protocols impacting NBA's roster size aside, Jason, this was kind of your idea, talking about the Saudi Arabia shows in WWE. And I guess I'll start with this. It feels a little bit, the more shows that this is probably WWE strategy. It's the more shows that they run, the more normalized it becomes. And I don't feel like people are talking about the shows in Saudi Arabia as much as they used to, which makes sense because I guess if you go back to, I would say there was controversy when they first announced the shows. There was controversy after, before the second show, the Crown Jewel show, because that was so close after the Jamal Khashoggi murder, which, I think changed a lot of Americans' perceptions on Saudi Arabia. It was a major news story that I think taught a lot of Americans about some of the autocratic policies that have been going on in Saudi Arabia. And but after that, after they went through with Crown Jewel, they took a lot of heat for it. They were on the who was the late night talk show guy that was doing it? John Oliver, right? They went on, John Oliver
Yes.
did a segment on it. There was heat on them, but they've kind of skated through it. It's classic Vince McMahon, where you never apologize, you just double down, and if you keep doing something, it becomes normalized. And that's kind of what's happened here with the Saudi Arabia shows. I feel like more and more wrestling fans and wrestling media have become just like, oh yeah, they're going to Saudi Arabia. That's what they do all the time. And we're not looking at it the same way, when realistically, it's just as bad as it was a few years ago. There's just as many questions, if not more, that need to be raised about these shows. But because WWE has done so many of them and it's become such a regular tradition for them now, they feel like more normalized. And I think that's very a dangerous concept. And I don't really know what wrestling fans can do about it. I mean, I personally, I don't watch these shows. And, that's not like saying I'm making a moral stand on it, but it would become more, I would have to, to ask of myself, like, what more can I do about this other than use a media platform to raise awareness about it? I don't know. What's your take on how people talk and feel about the Saudi Arabia shows? Do you feel like it's become so normalized, or it's just not getting the same kind of attention that it used to be? And like, what is your kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, just speaking about COVID, like the last show that they did was pre-COVID. The last pre-COVID show was in February, and they took a pretty long layoff after that. The next show during the pandemic was on October 2021, and so they took a pretty long layoff after that. And of course, like when I brought this up to you, I sort of raised the question of, are these shows like worth the hassle, right? WWE and their SEC filings, they sort of categorize it in a very different manner. We started talking about this briefly, before we went on, but like, they get around $45-55 million for these shows from the General Sports Authority in Saudi Arabia. And, I think it's a good point to sort of note that, the more these go on, they are normalized. And I think that's pretty much the goal for this. That was the initial goal when WWE and Saudi Arabia sort of, the General Sports Authority, at least, they made this partnership. It was part of the Saudi Vision 2030. It's this sort of, I guess, progressive campaign, quote unquote progressive campaign, to really just normalize Saudi Arabia in front of Western, and for Westerners. I think most people, like you said, the general public doesn't really understand the relationship the U.S. has with Saudi Arabia. It pretty much goes deep to World War II. So it's been a pretty long while that the U.S. has had pretty strong economic relations with Saudi Arabia. And so it's kind of just, in the background for most people's eyes. But yeah, definitely the Jamal Khashoggi murder, just how public it was. And especially with, Jamal Khashoggi being a journalist, that definitely raised the eyes for media people as well. We talk about a media member getting, brutally murdered by a government, at least, allegedly. I just had that there just for safekeeping. But that definitely added more attention to it with Khashoggi being a journalist and all that. And it definitely, I think most people are kind of in your camp, Jesse, where they just choose not to watch these shows. And in essence, these shows are, like, if you want to use their canon, like, they're not really in the WWE canon. These shows kind of just happen, and nothing really comes out from that. Shane McMahon is, the best wrestler in the world in, winning the World Cup, but that doesn't really get mentioned that often. Who won the greatest World Rumble? Like, I doubt many people would actually remember that. They're mostly remembered for the negative aspects, mostly the Goldberg Undertaker match, or just Goldberg in general. It seems to be the big sort of memory from these shows, mostly negative wise. He did have a very positive showing universally in the last Saudi Arabia show, but for the most part, just his botch tombstone with the Undertaker, him defeating the Fiend in very quick fashion, started just burying him and his run at the top in the main event scene in WWE. And so what should people do about this? It's, I think it's a big question just throughout. It's, right. We have, I think a lot of people do want to take sort of a moral stance and say, oh, I'm not watching these shows, I'm boycotting it. I know some, wrestling YouTubers, they do like their own charity live streams, just as a sort of, I guess, a moral stance on it. But even then, like, WWE is still getting paid for these shows. And so it sort of seems like a more personal moral justice kind of a thing. You're just kind of helping yourself. WWE isn't really being affected by this at all. It's sort of the same thing when people say they want to boycott WWE, or back in the day, I remember, was it the Fiend versus Seth Rollins and that very bad finish in Hell in a Cell? People were going to cancel their WWE Network subscriptions, but clearly people didn't do that enough, or it just didn't really matter, how many people canceled their subscriptions. WWE were still going to churn the machine going, and so it's always very tough to sort of combat that. There really isn't any right answers unless there is actual outside authority, which there was briefly, after before 2018, before they did the first ever Crown Jewel show and the second Saudi Arabia show. Politicians were asking WWE to maybe hold back on this, and it was kind of a touchy spot for Linda McMahon at the time, who was part of the Trump administration as the head of small business administration. So it was a bit of a touchy subject for her. I believe Stephanie McMahon, she did an interview of why they did that show. She just sort of said it was a business decision, which I guess is kind of true, but at the same time, it's like, you could be making other business deals. We're obviously seeing, live TV sports rights fees, they are increasing, continuously for all sports. Even MLS, like the TV rights deal is going to probably, triple or quadruple, probably, reading from sports writers for MLS. And so W could easily make more money with their Fox deal, or even Amazon, Apple, they're getting into the sports business as well. And so, like, do you really need this extra $55 million? Maybe, but like, you could probably get that somewhere else.
Right. So, like, here's the thing about, so WWE with its massive amounts of revenue, while the Saudi Arabia shows are a big piece of that revenue pie, you can look at how much revenue they generate each year. You can look at how valuable the TV deals are, how valuable the Peacock deal is, and say, okay, they don't need this $50 million, right? They don't need it. They can easily get through it and still clear record profits. But what I think, like, a lot of people don't understand is that's not how, like, business works. That's not how capitalism works. WWE is being asked, okay, so they made X amount of revenue last year and it was a record year. The standard they're being held to is to top their previous year in revenue. That's what I don't think people understand with, like, the talent cuts, and okay, they're set as budget cuts, and that's obviously a joke because they really have so much money that they don't have to cut these people. But they're looking at their bottom line and saying, we need to top last year's total. And so, yeah, maybe we do need to shed some salary. Maybe we don't want to pay Braun Strowman because we need to get above where we were last year, because that's what our investors want. And that's what's the Saudi Arabia show. They're never going to cut that because that's such a huge piece for them. Even if you can say, oh, if they made, I don't know what their revenue is. Let's say they made $1.1 billion in revenue last year. I don't know if that's high or low, what they actually made, maybe a little high, but they're not going to cut 50 million out of that, or 100 million if you're doing 2 shows a year. That's just not going to happen. The money's too big for them to punt on that, and they're not going to take that bullet and say, unless people stopped watching the product to such an insane degree that their TV deals lost all their value, then they probably wouldn't go if they could pinpoint the Saudi Arabia shows as a reason for that. I just don't think that enough of the fan base would be motivated enough to do that. And so it's not going to act like WWE is not going to stop doing these shows unless government intervenes. And I just don't see that happening. I wanted to kind of touch on, like, why these shows happen, why Saudi Arabia is paying WWE so much money to have these shows here. It's a very unusual circumstances where you would see like a bot show like this, in the sense that, WWE doesn't have to worry about the gate. They don't have to worry about how many people are tuning in on Peacock or the WWE network if you're an international fan. It's all about pleasing Saudi Arabia. And so this is going to be like a very, very brief and inexact explanation for like the history of the Middle Eastern region. But basically, these countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, right? They're very, very wealthy countries because they have oil. And the people running those countries are not dumb, and they know that they cannot rely on oil forever. It's a finite resource. A lot of things are transitioning away from petroleum. So you're never just going to be able to make all this money off of oil. A lot of these places are also relatively limited economically because if Saudi Arabia is a desert, there's not like a ton of stuff going on in Saudi Arabia outside of oil. Other countries like Qatar and UAE are quite small. So that basically what they're doing is they're using the money that they have from the oil to figure out how they can become more economically diverse in the future. They want to be less oil dependent. And a big hook is tourism. And they want to be seen as a tourist destination. And so by promoting your country at an international level to people in the West, people in America, WWE fans watching at home or in Europe, is a way to try to get people to think about your country in a new light, as a way to think about your country as being cool or hip and an awesome place to be. And so having these special events is a way to try to do that. And the term sports washing gets thrown a lot because the idea is you're using sports, which are one of the most universally appealing brands, right? In the world. You get people to know about stuff. Like a lot of people, like, think about how powerful sports are when it comes to, geography and recognition. Like we were talking about the NBA earlier, Jason, like when you think of other cities in the country, don't you think of their sports teams like pretty quickly? Like if I were to tell you like, Jason, tell me something about Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, right? You would think, oh, the Oklahoma City Thunder. Yep. Or like Portland, Oregon, and be like, oh yeah, the Portland Trailblazers. So sports are a really powerful thing. And so they're obviously going to be lucrative in the sense that something that these countries want to go after to help market themselves. And this would all be a very honest policy. There's nothing wrong inherently with, we want to market our country, so we're going to sponsor, this and that, right? Like that's pretty basic stuff. Like the problem that I think a lot of people have with this is that a lot of these countries are not, along with the times. They are, Saudi Arabia is an autocratic kingdom, run by a royal family who controls everything, and the human rights abuses. I don't really want to get like all into like exactly what they're doing, like the war in Yemen and how they treat women and all that stuff like that, because I think that's been beat to death. But we know that it's not up to the standards of the modern 2022 world. Even though there's a lot of bad stuff happening all over the world, it's pretty obvious, in a lot of these countries that have, autocratic leadership that very, religiously fundamentalist views, not what I think a lot of people would want out of a modern society. And so they're using these special events and these sports events like the WWE shows in Saudi Arabia to, sports wash would be, so people think about the sports and they think about the fun that's going on there and not about the human rights abuses. And that, coming on the heels of the Jamal Khashoggi murder, which was basically Saudi Arabia killed Jamal Khashoggi while he was in Turkey, I believe, when he was visiting the Saudi Arabian embassy in Turkey, because Khashoggi, who had relocated to America and was a columnist for the Washington Post, was very outspoken about the human rights abuses that were going on in Saudi Arabia and the kind of leadership, that was responsible for that. And so that put a big onus on the human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia. And so coming on the heels of that is WWE doing these shows in Saudi Arabia and being used as a way to sports wash the human rights abuses and some of the negative things about their country. And I think that people ethically should have, I don't know, I always thought it was like strange. Like, so the first show they ever do, well, first, do you have anything to say after from what I just said?
Yeah, I think just put simply, like, these governments are very conservative in nature. I think that's the best way to simply put it. Like, they have very conservative values and very conservative sort of viewpoints. Obviously, their views towards women are, very front and center, especially with, you see the way the WWE wrestlers, the women's wrestlers are dressed. They're not dressed in their traditional gear. They have to put on very special clothing, because, yeah, as in the first show, they showed an advert of the women just in the regular gear, and the General Sports Authority have issued an apology for indecent showing. And so it shows how very conservative these organizations and these leaders are. And so, yeah, I mean, obviously, with the first show as well, WWE also added to the propaganda of all this, of normalization of Saudi Arabia as well, which I think you might get into with, the whole issue with the first show.
Right. So the first show, which happens pre-Jamal Khashoggi, so a lot of the average American is not quite aware. Like, they probably, it's like they probably, a lot of people are probably aware. I'm like, oh yeah, they don't treat women well in these fundamentalist, Muslim countries. A lot of people would be aware of that, but they wouldn't really know that much about it to the extent. They wouldn't know that much about like the autocracy that's going on there. The Khashoggi murder really put that in a prominent light, which is why Crown Jewel was like the most problematic show they ever did, the first one, because it came only a few weeks after the murder came out. But so that first show, Greatest Royal Rumble, a lot of people, oh, they're going to do the show in Saudi Arabia. It's weird that they're doing it in Saudi Arabia. It's weird that they're calling something the Royal Rumble. It's weird that they are taking this money from this country that has a negative human rights action, or history with itself. But on that episode, on that one, you can still find this, I think, on YouTube. They run a video for Saudi Arabia, and it's just a total propaganda video. It's all about how great everything is in Saudi Arabia, how great, MBS, their leader, is. It's, they got they had like a Formula One driver talk about how great living in Saudi Arabia is. I think they got a woman to say like, oh, we can learn how to drive now, like, which is like a really big own goal, in my opinion, to like a cell phone on that end. But they basically had this and they have not, to my knowledge, not run a similar commercial since. After the Khashoggi murder, and there was way more heat on them for going to Saudi Arabia, they kind of curbtailed that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But they ran this video, and to me as a fan, and I watched that first event, it was the only one I've watched. You watch that, and it's like, WWE fans should be mad about this, because what WWE has done is that they have taken their audience, our eyeballs, and sold them to the Saudi Arabian government so that we can view this propaganda video, because that's what that shit is. It's, oh yeah, we have 1.2 million WWE Network subscribers, and they're all going to watch the show because it's going to be a big deal, and they'll see your video, and they'll love Saudi Arabia after they see it. That's the business deal, and that made me really mad, because it's one thing to just, oh yeah, we'll take their money, haha, wink wink, but it was more like, okay, now we're going to take you, the consumer, and we're going to sell your eyeballs and your audience, where you're going to be watching this wrestling show because you love wrestling, but don't forget, you're going to see this advertisement for the Saudi Arabian government that's full of a bunch of bullshit and lies. And that should, I think, if you're a viewer and like you can watch it like, oh, I don't care, the show's in Saudi Arabia, and it's like, well, you should care, because WWE is using your interest in wrestling and selling that interest to, autocratic dictators. And I think that was a real game changer for me as a fan, where I'm like, I cannot watch you. I already was kind of like bullshit on the shows, but now I was like, I'm not watching any more of these in the future. And they haven't done the video. Like I said, there's more heat since then, but it was, I would call that extremely problematic and something that should make fans really mad.
Yeah, definitely after the latest show, I think Goldberg, he just sort of went out to defend these shows as well. He started trying to defend, saying, "Oh, the country's more westernizing." That's the word they use, westernizing, which is
just doing their mouth, just doing their, like, again, yeah. Just, I saw that. I remember Goldberg said, like, I don't really know what the big deal is. I think they're doing a lot of good things here in Saudi Arabia. And it's like, I'm sure Goldberg, who gets paid like over $1 million to work a 3-minute match in Saudi Arabia, thinks things are going great. If someone was paying me $1 million for 3 minutes of work, I would be like, yeah, well, what's wrong with them?
Yeah, I mean that's sort of the point, right? Like, these celebrities and athletes and such, I'm sure they get treated very well when they go visit these countries like Saudi Arabia
Not if you're in not
or
if you're on
North
that
Korea.
plane.
Right, except for like, yeah, like one incident there. But yeah, for the most part, when we talk about the civilians of these countries, many of which, like with the women drivers, right, activists were promoting, trying to change those policies and laws. And I think for most people, they don't know, especially in those propaganda videos, that most of those activists get put in prison even after those laws get changed. And so it's very much a contrast there. But yeah, ever since then, they haven't really mentioned Saudi Arabia in general. These shows are not called Saudi Arabia shows, even that's what most people call them. They're called large scale international events. I'm sure they're adding, premium large scale international events after their premium live events changing for pay-per-views. But yeah, the words Saudi Arabia is never used. And I watched like bits and pieces of the last show, and Michael Cole and all the other commentators, they don't really get into the propaganda as much. But still, these shows do exist, and as you mentioned before, like, what do viewers have do with this? Like you said, it's highly doubtful that there will be enough people not watching these shows to have any real effect. You'll probably have a couple thousand, maybe at least, but still, you're comparing what, like, 1 million plus, potential Peacock subscribers who only watch WWE stuff. And so it's really not making a huge effect. And so that's really the big dichotomy and really big struggle there. Like, these shows will continue until I believe it's like a 8, 7, 10-year deal or something like that,
I believe it was
with
10-year
this
deal.
partnership. Yeah, so we're 7-year deal, and so we're like basically 4 years into a 7-year deal, but we did have the pandemic as well, and so I don't know whether we'll give you an extension on that because of the COVID pandemic, and so like you weren't able to run as many shows, and so maybe they'll get another 4 or 5 years into this deal as well, and so it doesn't really seem like the show is going to stop anytime soon.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I think is really interesting. You mentioned, like, Goldberg and the videos that they would run, and they would show like, oh, here's Seth Rollins, he's having so much fun in Saudi Arabia. That stuff's gone. I mean, they're afraid to say the word Saudi Arabia. They're afraid to bring it up. They promote the event. They put stuff on the events and stuff like that because they have to from a geopolitical standpoint. But they kind of want the event to kind of come and go also, in a sense that they don't mention where it is. It's happening in a mystery location. They ran a video for this upcoming show. Maybe I'm trying to remember. It might have been the Crown Jewel show from October 2021. It might have been more recently, and it was for Elimination Chamber. I can't remember exactly, but they aired a vignette for it during one of the pay-per-views. Maybe it was like during SummerSlam, and it was for the October show. But they're like, they ran this thing. It's like, in October, WWE returns to the place where magic happens. There was something like that. They said like the place where everything is smiles or something like that. And they never told you where that place was. They never told you it was. They never said, in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, or in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. They never said the location of it. They just said, we're going back to that place. That's really awesome. But we won't say where it is, but it's really awesome. And it just feels like they're kind of playing these, I don't know, it seems like they're playing like they're walking a tightrope, right? Where they obligated to do some promotion for Saudi Arabia on these shows. That's why Saudi Arabia is paying for these shows. But at the same time, they don't want to alienate Western audiences by bringing it up Saudi Arabia. So it'll be interesting to see, like, if that comes to a head. We know from the plane incident that Vince and the Crown Prince, or whoever in the Saudi Arabian government, haven't always gotten along. Yeah. And there was contentious relationships about WWE not being paid for their shows. Let's get into the plane incident. Okay. So I'll just, to recap really quick, Crown Jewel 2019, the second Crown Jewel show, the one that had the Fiend and Seth Rollins wrestling after their Hell in a Cell match. They had all these wrestlers. They had like 175 wrestlers and production staff and other employees boarded the 747 charter flight at the airport, and they remained stuck inside the plane for more than 6 hours. Some other wrestlers like on the plane, like Cesaro, I think was one of them, like arranged their own separate charters, like I'm getting out of here. And the story we've gotten out of that basically is that for some reason Vince McMahon cut the feed of the pay-per-view during the event because I think WWE hadn't been paid for their previous events. And so it was kind of like this dick measuring contest between Vince and the Saudi Arabian government. And the Saudi Arabian government basically responded by holding up the plane and trying to fuck with them, I guess. And all the rest. Wrestlers were scared. Wrestlers thought they were going to be political prisoners that, they had wrestlers coming back saying, I'm never going back ever again. And so they did all this stuff. And so it's like, so I bring that up because it's not like these guys it's kind of like a political game between WWE, between Saudi Arabia, between, advertisers and marketing people and stuff like that, because like I said, WWE doesn't want to say Saudi Arabia on their shows, but they're being paid to say Saudi Arabia on their shows, basically. And I wonder if that ever comes to a head again, because I think when Saudi Arabia originally signed the deal, the idea was to have videos like that propaganda video from the very first show on every show. And that hasn't been the case. And I wonder politically if that's going to change, in the next few years as they continue with this deal.
Yeah, and of course, the whole, Saudi Arabia potentially not paying WWE, that eventually led to a class action lawsuits around that time as well.
Thing.
Yeah, and then so, the whole wrestlers being held hostage thing, of course, Jerry McDevitt, WWE's lawyer, at least, one of their more prominent lawyers that gets talked about a lot in wrestling circles. He's sort of denied that rumor, but it's kind of his job to do so. So again, a lot of murky details. Some details have come out via that class action lawsuits from this plane incident. That's kind of how we know a lot of this information as well. Obviously, some people have done their, digging through their sources, but this class action lawsuit has really, obviously with the interviews and the depositions have really opened up some details.
Yeah, and WWE settled that lawsuit out of court, and part of that was probably because they knew they were going to lose, and so they thought they could save a little bit of money by settling. But also part of it maybe was that they didn't want all of that information to get out. They didn't want people, standing trial against them and testifying and that kind of aspect of it. So that's a whole other element to this thing. And I think it's important to mention, and part of the reason I feel like these shows have become more accepted to the general public, at least, is that WWE is not the only entertainment entity that is participating in this kind of thing. Barcelona and Real Madrid played a game against each other a few weeks ago. El Clasico, the biggest game La Liga has, although I believe it was a cup game. It wasn't a La Liga game, but it was still, the two biggest soccer teams in Spain, two of the biggest soccer clubs in the world, if not the two biggest. They played each other in a competitive game, and they did it in Saudi Arabia. They didn't do it in Barcelona. They didn't do it in Madrid. They did it in, I think they did it in Riyadh. And it was because they got a lot of money to bring the biggest soccer game, the biggest club rivalry in soccer to Saudi Arabia. The World Cup is happening later this year in Qatar, and it doesn't take a genius to figure out what that is. And that's nothing, WrestleMania or these Saudi Arabia shows are nothing compared to that, Qatar World Cup, which we could talk about at length about why that's taking place, how it took place, obviously what its intent is, but it's generally, it's because people think of Qatar as the place that hosts the World Cup. And whoa, let me go to Qatar to go to the World Cup, and not, for anything else that might be happening in that country. So it's one of those, it's WWE is not alone in this. I'm a big fan of like amusement parks and the amusement park industry, and Saudi Arabia is building a really big park there. I want to say it's a Six Flags park, but there was a Six Flags I can't remember. There was a Six Flags Dubai that was proposed. And I think that failed, but I think Six Flags is now doing something in Saudi Arabia. Dubai has built a couple of really, expensive theme parks that people really would like to go to in the, in the theme park community. They look really cool. There's like Warner Brothers movie world. There's Ferrari World, which has the world's fastest roller coaster, which some people might be familiar with. In Dubai. So like, it's just, there's a lot going on here beyond just WWE taking, doing some shows. They pay for, big concerts happen in these countries now, all same thing. They're bought and paid for by the governments. And the idea is that they'll advertise these countries to the broader world and be seen as a place you want to go to and a place that looks cool. And so WWE is not alone in this. A lot of other, mainstream, major sports and entertainment entities are also involved in doing this. So it's not exclusively a WWE problem, which helps normalize it to an extent, because WWE can point to, oh, we're not doing anything different than what anyone else is doing, and we're not doing anything different than a bunch of other American companies are doing. Even if I do think it still doesn't make it right.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't make it right. I'm a fan of K-pop, and so BTS, the biggest K-pop group in the world, they've done a concert in Saudi Arabia as well. And so, you have them on there. And so it's really normalizing it there for their millions of fans. And, again, is WWE's excuse there of why should we stop? Other countries are doing this as well. But, we even get to like some wrestlers who aren't even allowed, or some that aren't even participating. Before you had Daniel Bryan, he wasn't doing on these shows. Obviously, as Brian Danielson in AEW, that doesn't have to be obligated to do these shows anymore. But Sami Zayn has never been around on these shows due to his Syrian heritage, and obviously the issues with Syria and Saudi Arabia are, Google it. I'll say that. Read a Vox article, VOX. They have very good explainer articles explaining the Syria Saudi Arabia situation. But Sami Zayn is not on these shows, and as a result, Kevin Owens I think he appears sometimes, but I think just out of respect for his friend, he hasn't been on part of these shows. And just shout out Sami Zayn, he's done his charity drive for Syrian refugees as well, as part of his Syrian heritage during these events as well. And so he's trying to do his parts. I believe Aleister Black, he hasn't done these shows, but there's no real clear reason why. I remember, speaking of Goldberg, I think he did say in the Pat McAfee show that due to his Jewish heritage, he was a bit scared about all of that, but that obviously never really played into any effect. I think, some people know that Paul Heyman, with his Jewish heritage as well, and Saudi Arabia and Israel's sort of conflicts, that might be an issue, but doesn't really appear to be so, at least not specifically to them. But, I think Sami Zayn definitely is someone that is pointed out, and also the women of the roster, though I guess you are seeing a lot more women's matches on these events in very sort of limited fashion. I think what does cloud these things is, these historical achievements, right? That I think helps normalize it even more. I think Jessica Carr, I think she is the female female referee. She's the first female referee to be to ref a wrestling match in Saudi Arabia. That was very much played as a big deal, even amongst people who are morally object to these shows. They are praising that historical achievement as well. I think even as you do that even more, that doesn't really help sort of unnormalize it. I think it helps it normalize it even more, and doesn't really help the case as well. It's sort of like when conservatives, sort of say like, oh, there's no racism in America. Barack Obama was the president. It's like, oh, there's nothing wrong with discrimination of women.
Right.
There's female wrestlers and female referees. There's nothing wrong here. I think that helps normalize these types of things.
Right. And well, part of the whole reason this is that I mean, one of the things that makes this worse is because WWE likes to get on its high horse and likes to take a moral stand on things. And so it's really, they can't give themselves enough pat on the backs for how they've, the women's revolution and all that stuff like that. And they can point to, oh, we had the first match in Saudi Arabia. And, the woman had to wear big baggy clothing because you wouldn't want men to see a woman's figure. But they pat themselves on the back because of that. And I think it's really, it makes it more frustrating if you're a fan. It's like, okay, you guys are going to pat yourselves on the back for this, but you're still taking all of this money to be propaganda for a country that does not treat women with anything close to, what we consider an acceptable amount of respect. And that's one of those things that I think makes it like really annoying as a fan to be like, okay, and it's one of those things that WWE will always have this black mark on it for the Saudi Arabia shows. They'll never escape it. As although we said that it's been normalized a little bit, it's something that will always be used against them. I know, when they had a comment in the Toronto Star article about AEW, these women, self, gory self mutilation. If people say that, WWE wants to get on its high horse and say, well, we would never do something like that, which is what that statement was. And it's like, WWE does Saudi Arabia shows. And someone said, WWE is fine with blood as long as there's money attached to it. And so it's one of those things that I think is really frustrating as a fan to see, and you have to deal with WWE's moral superiority over, how great they are, how progressive they are. Really WWE and Saudi Arabia go hand in hand because they both like talking about how progressive and great they are, even though if you actually examine it, they're totally backwards. So that becomes a frustrating element to it, like you said, and it makes it, you made a really good point, I think, about like, oh, they can now say, oh, women, we had the first women referee. Like, who cares? Oh, because WWE finally decided that women can be referees a few years ago, that they were able to, the first woman to referee a wrestling match in Saudi Arabia. And it's like, who cares about that? Like, ultimately, who really cares about that? And you're right. There are people out there who will be morally opposed to it. And they'll say, I can't believe they're doing this in Saudi Arabia. But at the same time, be like, this is a great accomplishment. Congratulations, Jessica Carr. And it's like, no, you guys should be mad about this. It's just one of those, it's just one of those things.
Well, it's kind of funny you say like it's a black mark for WWE. I mean, just add it to the list, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of like, I think that's sort of what helps WWE in an ironic sort of sense, continuing over the edge after when Hart, died, the whole steroid lawsuits, so many things, the Ring Boy scandal. There's just so many types of incidents and black marks on WWE that this Saudi Arabia show might even just be a footnote in all of that. Just Vince McMahon, anti-union sort of sentiments as well. Like, there's just so much black marks that this is just like added to the list.
Yes, it's the Trump strategy of let's do and say so many, terrible things that you can't hone in on just one of them to use as an example, and people will become less reactionary to the horrible things because they'll be accepting that it happens all the time. And
I mean, even just this week, the Gunther Stark thing,
yeah.
Even just that, even just as recent as this week.
Yeah. So yeah, this week WWE named a character after a Nazi. And so it just so I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the shows themselves, maybe bring it back to more of a wrestling perspective, just briefly, because we've talked about, I think, why the shows are problematic and why they're being done, but I'm kind of interested in seeing a couple of things. The first is, like I said, I don't watch these shows, and part of that is I don't want to morally watch the show. I don't want to be subjected to another Saudi propaganda video. My life is better if I don't see that. But part of it is that the shows are very skippable in the sense that they take place on a Thursday or Friday afternoon because they're happening, on prime time in Saudi Arabia, which is not prime time on the East Coast of the United States. So you can kind of I'm usually working during them anyway. So it's like not that hard to skip them. But part of these shows is that they always feel like they have to have a big marquee match in a way that they don't on pretty much any of their other shows. Part of the deal is I think they have to get something special for these shows. So they have to bring in a part-time wrestler. They have to put together a match that you wouldn't see at any other time. Because the show's so valuable, it makes sense for them to do that. Like, the show is more valuable than WrestleMania. So you can give away what would be considered a WrestleMania main event on these shows. You almost have to, because that's part of the deal, is you want to have a special show that people feel like they have to tune into. And I'm curious to know, how many more of those matches does WWE have up its sleeve? You look at the main events, that have these shows, right? You have the DX versus the Brothers of Destruction match, the Undertaker versus Goldberg, Brock Lesnar and Roman Reigns. I wonder, WWE, because WWE as a company doesn't have that many marquee matches that they can give away, It's why we're seeing like Roman Reigns versus Brock Lesnar be stretched out to an insane degree, because that's really one of the only matches WWE has that feels like it's between two big stars who are protected in the booking. So it feels like a big deal. They've just done a really bad job elevating new people into those positions to make, their matches feel special. And they're relying so much on these older wrestlers to kind of anchor these big Saudi Arabia shows because they need something special. And the only thing that they have to go to is, let's go back to guys from the past, and maybe they wrestle each other, or maybe they wrestle someone from now, but we need one of these big headline guys. That's why Goldberg is always there, because Goldberg is one of the guys that they can bring in for those special shows and make it feel different. And I wonder, like, moving forward, like, Undertaker's retired. I don't know if you'll ever see Triple H wrestle again. I'm pretty skeptical that that's going to happen due to his health issues that we don't know, admittedly don't know a ton about, but the fact that we don't know a ton about them and doesn't seem to be in the plans of WWE really makes me think that it's very unlikely we'll see him wrestle ever again. I'm happy to be proven wrong. I hope he's healthy enough to wrestle again, realistically, just for his own life's sake. But, he's out of the picture. Goldberg, he's got one more year. I guess he said he's got one more match on his deal with them. I bank on his match probably being the show in February. Put him in the Elimination Chamber, right? And he seems like someone that'll probably re-sign with WWE. I don't think he's gonna like go to AEW unless he just wants to retire and not wrestle again, which I don't know why he would if he physically feels like he can still do it, because he's able to make so much money doing very little work. So you have Goldberg. Brock, you can, I don't know with Brock how much longer is he going to be around as a wrestler? Is he going to want to do the Saudi Arabia shows? Maybe you could use him, but you really don't. You're losing guys that can make you You're basically losing part-time guys that you can bring in and make these shows feel special. I mean, Cena has never appeared on one of these shows, right?
Just one time, maybe.
Has he? I don't think he has. I think it's been this thing where Cena has an eye on his movie career and says, you know what, he's too big of a celebrity to do this. And you're not going to see The Rock. Batista said he's done and he's retired, and he's also someone who probably is too big of a celebrity to want to get tangled up in this, because he's got more lucrative outside wrestling interests in a way that people like Brock Lesnar and Goldberg don't have. I'm curious to know, like, how can they continue to come up with these special matches and events when their roster is so thin of wrestlers who truly feel special? And I think looking at it just from, I think it's interesting examination of WWE's booking, in the sense that they don't have these major matches that they had, only a few years ago, because the well is running dry when it comes to the kind of talent who feel special that they can bring back and put over.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. For the World Cup, one like the whole tournament that they did, John Cena was scheduled for it, but he was replaced by Bobby Lashley. I don't think he gave a reason, but I think you're right. Yeah, with the whole him seeing Hollywood, and especially with the whole China controversy, like he got himself in trouble there, and I doubt he wants to get himself into any more trouble, especially as he's growing as a mainstream star.
Yeah, it's totally not worth it for someone. Like for Goldberg, I totally understand why Goldberg's going over there, or the Undertaker, or these people who, but like for people like John Cena, it's like, yeah, I'm gonna pass on that. Yeah, I can make $1 million doing this match, but it's why would you risk that?
And also on other shows like Crown Jewel 2019, like you mentioned the main events like Bray Wyatt, Seth Rollins, but even on that show itself, Tyson Fury taking on Braun Strowman, Brock versus Cain Velasquez.
Yeah, so you see these yeah, you're right. They do the non-wrestler appearances. I forgot about the Tyson Fury and Cain Velasquez appearances, but yeah, that's another thing. And like Tyson Fury's being brought in because Saudi Arabia is paying him a lot of money to do that.
Yeah, he had another boxing fight, I believe, in Saudi Arabia as well, or at least maybe it was scheduled or something like that.
Yeah, no, there's been big fights and stuff like that. UFC has done, the Fight Island, and they've done stuff in the Middle East as well. Just another example of the kind of connection that these major sporting events are trying to have in these countries. I mean, it's not without the realm. It's not out of the realm of the possibility that like the Super Bowl could be in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, certainly possible. But I mean, obviously, like I mean, just no offense to him, like Mansoor is always just guaranteed to be booked and to win on this show.
Right, and he's
I mean,
never
I
booked.
mean,
He's never booked competently anywhere
yeah, and
else.
he's not even that bad. He's not that bad
No,
of a
I wish
wrestler,
they
but
booked him better.
yeah, I mean that's the thing. I don't want to be too mean to him. Like he's always guaranteed to win on these shows and guaranteed to be booked strong on these shows. But yeah, he's a decent worker. Like he's not even that bad.
Yeah, no, like Mansoor's like a young person that's actually pretty good at wrestling. So like I wish they would push him, outside of that. But
Yeah,
they yeah, like he won like the Wrestling World Cup, right? He beat Cesaro or something in the final. And another thing, these shows are almost so I don't watch the shows, so I can't give my full thoughts on them. My understanding is that the Crown Jewel show in October was very well received by WWE fans. I believe that it had like the edge in Seth Rollins' Hell in a Cell match that I think
yep.
a lot of people said was the best match in WWE last year. That show was very successful, critically successful, but most of these shows suck. Like, the Undertaker versus Goldberg match was a complete disaster as the main event. One of the most like botch heavy matches you'll see. Like the whole match could just be one episode of Botchamania. The DX versus the Brothers of Destruction match. That match was bad too. And I like kind of like, like Shawn Michaels went for a moonsault to the outside and nobody caught him and he landed right on his face and he got up and he like looked in like it was like you could just see in his face and he's like, fuck man, I wish I didn't do this match.
And Triple H tore his pec during
Yeah,
that
like
match
that
too.
was another disaster. You had Goldberg squashing Bray Wyatt, which was again negatively received. Like these have been really bad shows. I admit that the Crown Jewel show from 2021 was received very well, but it's not like these shows have been very good, which again makes them pretty skippable. If you're a fan who doesn't really want to watch them, it's not that hard to ignore them. And I like I said, I think Goldberg's going to be at this next show, but I don't even know what they're going to do. It's weird so you have the Royal Rumble, which is a major pay-per-view event for you in January. And then you have WrestleMania in early April, which obviously is WrestleMania. And so you're going to do this Elimination Chamber, special Saudi Arabia show, which really should be this marquee big show for you. And it's like, are you going to give away, all these matches on you're going to have to have something big for, the Royal Rumble is a show that you can kind of get away with not doing a super big card because the Rumble match is themselves are big draws. But the Elimination Chamber show, you're going to need to have a big match and you're going to need a big match for WrestleMania. So, and like I said, like we said, there's not a lot of big matches that WWE has up its sleeve. Like are you going to do Brock versus Roman at Elimination Chamber and then run it back for WrestleMania? You wanted to do that in day one. Maybe they move it to Elimination Chamber. I don't know what the booking is going to be on that end, but I'm interested in knowing like how are they going to continue to load up these Saudi Arabia shows with special, once in a year, once in a lifetime type matches when they just don't have the talent that make those matches feel special unless it's, how many times are we going to see Goldberg, wrestle before? I think Goldberg's stale already. I don't know if he feels like a big deal anymore.
Yeah, for sure, 100%. I mean, I guess from a business and a booking perspective, it kind of makes sense why they'd be doing this show in Saudi Arabia. Typically, at least in the past couple of years, this is mostly due to WWE's bad booking. Like the shows between Royal Rumble and WrestleMania don't really feel consequential, especially the fast lanes and all these other, even Elimination Chamber sometimes. They don't really feel important shows. It's mostly due to WWE's bad booking and how they don't really, they only care about, just one part, the beginning of the journey and the end of the journey. They kind of just play around with the middle parts of it. And then maybe that's why they're doing this in February, having an Elimination Chamber over there. But yeah, like, I don't know what kind of big match you can have, especially the one that is post Royal Rumble and also pre WrestleMania. They're probably going to have some type of number one contenders match, you would think, for the other title match other than the Rumble winner for that one, both for the men and the women, you would think. But even then, like, it just like what kind of big match can you give away over there in a show that you probably don't expect a lot of people to watch, or maybe you expect a lot of people to watch? And anyway, I don't know. I have no idea.
Yeah, I'd be interested in seeing like the viewership numbers for the Saudi Arabia shows because a couple things. They're very interesting. First, you have a lot of people who might punt on them from a moral perspective. They also have them that it's hard to watch them live, at least in the US. In Europe, maybe they do better because it's a more of a primetime slot in Europe and obviously a primetime slot in the Middle East. But in the US, it's not a primetime spot, so it's kind of easy to skip, even if you're semi-interested in it. Like maybe you get spoiled for you or whatever, so you don't watch it. But on the flip side, you also have really marquee matches that you would think if you're a big WWE fan, you have to watch. And so I would, is the average Saudi Arabian show viewed on Peacock the same way that like a B pay-per-view would? I'm sure it's not viewed as much as, the Royal Rumble or SummerSlam or Money in the Bank would be, but is it viewed as much as like, Backlash or Extreme Rules or Hell in a Cell? I don't know. It'd be interesting to see those numbers that we'll never ever see. The Elimination Chamber, I'll be interested to see if they have a women's Elimination Chamber match.
Right.
Because I still feel like they're semi-conservative with how they use the women on the Saudi Arabia shows. Obviously, from the outfits, they wear completely differently. I don't know if you want to have a bunch of women in the Elimination Chamber in Saudi Arabia. I don't know if optically that makes sense. Yeah,
Well, especially with the potential of some bleeding in that match, like even just like, not like the hard way, especially with how dangerous the match can be, there's potential for blood. And I don't know what kind of reaction that would be if there was blood in a women's match.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know. I think it wouldn't surprise me if they don't do the women's Elimination Chamber match, which, by the way, from a critical standpoint, I'm fine with that. We don't need 2 Elimination Chambers. We don't even need 1. It annoys me. Elimination Chamber is one of those things where I wish that they would do it when there was a storyline reason to do it, as opposed to, it's February, gotta have Elimination Chamber, just like how much I hated it's October, gotta have a Hell in a Cell match. And it's like, it doesn't fit into the booking all the time. And so that's one of those things that I'm annoyed by. But it'll be interesting to see if the women, like, to me, it's like almost like if you don't have the women Elimination Chamber match, it's going to raise a lot of questions because it is Saudi Arabia and you're already taking heat on it. But at the same time, do you want to optically have women in the Elimination Chamber match? I mean, they talked about, Dave Meltzer mentioned it, I get they opted to not do it, but they talked about changing the name, of the pay-per-view because the Elimination Chamber in Saudi Arabia is a poorly named show for a lot of reasons. It's up there with New Japan Pro Wrestling Destruction in Hiroshima.
Yeah.
as a poorly named show. The big one, they never did it because it got canceled because of COVID, but the NXT UK Takeover Dublin was a very poorly named show. UK, positioning the words UK Takeover Dublin does not sit well with the Irish contingency of fans, nor does it in my household. So that was another poorly named show. But yeah, Elimination. Now it's not Elimination Chamber in Saudi Arabia because they won't use those words. They won't use the Saudi Arabia words. But it is one of those things that not necessarily the most eloquently named show. Can you just call it? In Germany they don't call it Elimination Chamber. I believe they call it No Way Out, which was the old name for the February show. And because Elimination Chamber in Germany means is a reference to concentration camps. So obviously they wouldn't do that. I was kind of surprised that once they consider changing the name, like just call it No Way Out. Like what's the big deal?
Yeah, I mean maybe it's just some like SEO kind of thing that like maybe Elimination Chamber probably pops up more in Google searches perhaps than No Way Out. Maybe No Way Out's just too generic. Or whatever pops up in Vince McMahon's mind, whatever.
Well, I feel like they've kind of gotten away from the gimmick pay-per-views, because there was a time where you had your big 4 and then every other pay-per-view was a gimmick pay-per-view. It was TLC, Elimination Chamber, Fatal 4-Way. They had a Breaking Point where I believe all the matches were like submission matches, like that was I think like John Cena and Randy Orton had an I Quit match or something like that in the main event. You had Extreme Rules, and they axed TLC. They don't have Fatal 4-Way or Breaking Points anymore. They still have Hell in a Cell. So I feel like they're getting more back to the old model, which is like we're gonna have Backlash and we're gonna have WWE Day 1 and we're gonna have these these pay-per-views that just kind of have regular names, and then we have the gimmicks, you know, save the not they don't have to shoehorn gimmicks into them, but I guess Elimination Chamber is still in the docket because they're doing it, and they're doing it in Saudi Arabia next month.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting. You know, the last show had like 2 women's matches, and it was kind of a beefed up card, like 10 matches on the card, but like 2 of those were part of tournaments, like the King of the Ring and the Queen of the Ring tournaments.
Mhm.
I mean, it's WWE, so like maybe they could shoehorn in like a random tournaments in like the card itself and just do that.
Yeah, you know, they have done that. You know, we talked about they had the Wrestling World Cup.
Yep.
You know, they had
Greatest Royal Rumble, of course.
the Greatest Royal Rumble, which wasn't a tournament, but was like a gimmick match. Yeah, they do like to do that. They might just throw something together. It's like they're gonna have some trophy, or they're gonna have the green belt. I think that's what Strowman got. He got like a green world championship for Saudi Arabia, and they probably will do that. I mean, I don't know what the card's gonna look like. They probably don't even know what the card's going to look like because it's WWE. They might have an idea of we're going to have, you know, they're definitely going to have an Elimination Chamber match, at least one, but they could also have 2. And I'd be interested in seeing like if wrestlers take this trip off again. I like they've some of the people, you know, Danielson's no longer with the company. You know, Zayn and Owens re-signed, but I doubt they're going. I mean, the whole Sami Zayn thing, I know you mentioned already, but like, you know, for WWE and its love of talking about diversity, and to be so happy to play the Martin Luther King video on Monday, on Martin Luther King Day, and there are people out there that will stand really hard for WWE's diversity. I mean, they're in business with a show, with a nation that says, we don't want that guy on our show because he's from a certain place that we don't like. And that's, I mean, if you, again, this is one of those, it's a black mark on WWE. They can't escape it. If you can't say WWE's got this great diversity initiative at the same time when they're like, oh yeah, Sami Zayn can't be on these shows because he's Syrian and because, you know, he's proud of being Syrian, right? And he's you know, he wants to raise awareness about the troubles of Syria. Noam Dar isn't on these shows either because he's from Israel, which is you know, no one really can.
But on the other hand, like it's Noam Dar, like he's not
Yeah,
really
it's not
star.
important, but yeah, it's you know, it's one of those things that's like, you really can. WWE likes to take the high ground. They like to talk about how great they are and how progressive they are and how diversity it is, and it's things like that that really tell you that all this talk about diversity and women's revolution is all just marketing. It's trying to get more money out of you, and it's trying to make you feel good about watching the WWE show. And there's a dark underbelly to all of this stuff.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen any reporting on this either from whether it's the Observer or Fightful or PW Insider. I don't know if there's like an extra bonus payday for going on these shows because we haven't really seen anyone else sort of opt out of these shows, whether it's contractually, you know, they have to go to these shows, or whether like, hey, we will give you an extra bonus to go to this large scale international events. I don't know about that. You know, maybe that could play a factor in as well of wrestlers, you know, just choosing to be on these shows, or just, you know, like, hey, it's an extra payday and, you know, I don't want to miss out on paychecks, you know, because for, you know, whatever reason there. And so I'm very curious on that. I haven't really seen any reporting on whether there's an extra pay bump to be on these shows.
Yeah, I assume that everyone gets money for it. I assume that the average run of the mill talent makes more money off of the Saudi Arabia show than they make off of a normal, like an episode of Raw or something like that. But you're right, I haven't seen a real report on like, oh, the average WWE guy will make, you know, considerably more from the Saudi Arabia show, and that's why all these people are going, is because they want the money. I think a lot of people go because they want to remain in management's good graces, and they don't want to be like,
of course, yeah,
you know, oh, I don't want to go to that show because I have a problem with what you guys are doing in that show. Is not a good way to ingratiate yourself to management. And these are big you know, these shows are big opportunities. So a lot of people are like, yeah, I want to be on the show. Why wouldn't I be? Why wouldn't I be? And they think about it from that end. And I mean, I don't really blame anyone who goes there. Like it's it's your job. You know, I have a lot of respect for the people who say, no, I don't want to go, but you know, I'm not going to be like, oh, you know, Mustafa Ali went to the Saudi Arabia show, so I don't believe anything. I can't never support him, or if he wants to talk about some other initiative, I don't immediately dismiss him for that. I think for the big stars like your Goldbergs and your Brock Lesnar's and your Undertakers, those guys I think get a lot of money for these one shows, because that's oh, they're a special star, we're bringing you in. Those guys are making way more money, and that's why you see Goldberg on all of these shows. It's not because of his love of Saudi Arabia; it's for his love of making a lot of money in a short period of time. Yeah, so that's that. Yeah, I haven't thought about that as much, but you're right about. I think like what Gallows and Anderson said they were never going to go back, and then Carl Anderson said he did go back because he needed a new pool for something for his house, or he made a joke like that. These guys, I assume they're making more money than normal, but is it like?
It's like a WrestleMania payday, for an example.
Yeah, I don't know. It should be because of how much money they're getting for it, but we also know that's not how WWE operates.
Yeah, I mean that's just the thing. Like we don't really know about all this, but yeah, like you said, I don't really blame any like Mustafa Ali. I don't really blame him for being on these shows, or even Ricochet. I just remember that Brock Lesnar squashed Ricochet on one of these shows as well, and so it just sort of goes into how the quality of these shows isn't really that great, and so like I guess maybe quality is never really an imperative for WWE, it seems like, and so even like Raw's on every week and it's kind of just an abysmal show, but it's still on every week, and so I guess quality is never the reasoning why you would stop these shows, but they'll continue to get the $50 million for all these shows, and I think there were plans to do at least maybe at least 3. They typically do 2 a year. I think they were talks of trying to bump it to 3, but obviously the pandemic has kind of slowed that down a bit. But I think we can expect another show maybe in the fall, since this is the first one for 2022.
Yeah, I think the goal has been two shows a year. They only did one in 2019 because they did a show in February and then the pandemic ended up hitting, and they only did one show in 2020 because they couldn't really get over there safely until October. So I think the plan is 2 years at a time. That's how many they did in 2019 and 2018. So I would expect that to be the case. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the Elimination Chamber. If it's another good show like Crown Jewel, I think you'll see more people coming around on it, and oh yeah, sorry, having been more enthusiastic about them just because the quality is higher. If it stinks, I think it'll be more eye rolling. What do you think about like wrestling media and how they cover these shows? Because I mean, it's a broader question about media in general and how they cover certain things, and should they be forced to talk about these negative things? I don't really have a strong opinion on it, despite other strong opinions about the media when it comes to like, some people are really frustrated, like, oh, these websites they're just going to cover the Saudi Arabia show and they're not going to mention how horrible it is that they're doing it. And it's like, I get not wanting to do that, because if you're doing a review or something of a show, you don't want to like spend it talking about human rights abuses. If that's not your format and your listeners don't want to hear that, I don't know. I don't have a strong take on like how people should do it. I think it's kind of annoying when people take self-righteous stands on something, and then especially if it's wrestling related, like they want to rip a company or for doing something, if they want to rip WWE for how they represent a certain character or something like that, and then talk about how great the Saudi Arabia show is, and I'm so excited for it. I think then you become hypocritical, and then you should be trying to remain balanced on that. But I don't think like I don't know, like I don't really care like that sites cover this event because it's part of their job, and the interest is, if the interest is there, they'll do it. But it is raised some interesting questions about how media coverage should handle an event like this.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like this is part of their job to review these shows, and like I understand why sites maybe they are against these shows, but like we have to cover it for the site. You need we just need for the site, like it's part of their jobs. And so I agree. I don't really have a strong stance for the media in terms of like you don't have to mention human rights abuses all the time, especially if it's not your forte. Like I think that's the big thing for me, where you can really tell someone that is not really knowledgeable on a subject.
Yeah, I'm kind of talking out of my ass on the show, to be honest. Like as far as like I didn't want to get into like here's all the things women can't do in Saudi Arabia. I think it's easy to just say that we know that there are some abuses going on there, and we can. I don't want to talk about the war in Yemen
Sure,
or
sure.
stuff like that. But you're right. Like I'm not an expert on geopolitics.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something I'm interested in, but I agree. I'm also not an expert on this. I just based it off, all the other experts that I read and other books that I've read on the subject. But even then, I'm still not an expert on this. But still, if you're not an expert on this, you probably shouldn't be talking about this. It's the same with the speaking out movement as well, right? I think for people who aren't really adverse to these kind of topics, it's better to listen rather than to you spout out your own agenda for no particular reason. I think especially with if you're like wrestling media is very small in the media landscape, and so whatever you're going to say isn't really going to make a big difference. It's just the unfortunate fact. You are a very small spectacle in the whole media landscape. This is a very bigger for governments and for other people in power kind of a deal, rather than just a small, very 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 small grassroots kind of thing that isn't really going to manifest itself, because just the attitude from wrestling fans, it doesn't really seem like a big deal to them. It's just very much a very small minority of wrestling fans who have an adverse reaction to these kind of shows.
Yeah, like if you're wrestling media, your take is not going to reverberate outside of the wrestling bubble
Yeah, exactly.
like nothing ever does. So that's one thing. And it's like it's like if you're, we also, like you mentioned, speaking out, and that's another thing. It's, it's part of the culture is everyone has to have a take, right? You gotta have a hot take coming in. So yeah, well, what's my take on speaking out? Like, well, maybe you don't have to give a take on speaking out. It's not something you'd have to give out like a bold take for. And Saudi Arabia shows, you don't have to have a bold take if you don't want one. I don't know. I think some people, do they want, people to do a disclaimer before the show where they denounce Saudi Arabia, and they're like, Saudi Arabia's human rights abuses include like all of this terrible stuff, and then they're like, all right, let's talk about this Miz match, like, right after that. It's just, I think it's not always going to be like that, but it is an element to these shows about, how much media coverage are you going to dedicate to them, and do you ask the tough questions, and do you raise the tough questions about these shows if you were to interview somebody about them. I think WWE is really skated on not having to answer questions about Saudi Arabia, because you'd get more things like Goldberg, who I think really, put his foot in his mouth by talking about like, yeah, things are really westernizing. I think, WWE is helping improve society in Saudi Arabia. I was like, oh, come on. Like, you would get more stuff like that if the media was, I think, asking those questions when they would talk to WWE wrestlers. And if I was a WWE wrestler, I wouldn't want to be asked that question, but if you want to make the media rounds, I think that's something that has to be asked of these people.
Yeah, especially since the NXT media calls are pretty much dead, and even
those
like
they're never coming back.
Yeah, and even on like the quarter hour the quarterly earnings calls, like stock analysts, like this isn't really something that affects the stock, and so like they're never going to ask about this unless it is affecting the stock price.
Yeah, they'll ask about the lawsuit, or they'll ask about the Saudi Arabia shows, because those are really important to WWE's portfolio, is getting that revenue each year. So they'll ask those kind of questions. But from a moral standpoint, I'm not sure if they do it. I think from an advertising standpoint would be the biggest difference.
Yeah, sure.
As far as if advertisers are very brand conscious, and the whole point of advertising is for people to think positively about their brand. And do you want to be advertising with a company like WWE that is doing these kind of propaganda shows? I think that's a real question to be asked, especially because WWE is, has prided itself on being able to woo advertisers, and they're there to make sure that AEW can't, which is why they say things like, well, we don't think advertisers are going to be interested in the blood and guts of that show. But got anything else to add about our lovely Kingdom of Saudi Arabia shows before we sign off here, Jason?
No, nothing else to add. Again, if people are interested in the geopolitics of the region, just read some good books, watch some good YouTube videos, like Vox. They have a very good explainer videos of the whole region, and even on like even on the whole sports washing in general. There's lots of good info on all of that online. There's some good resources of more details for all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I was watching. I was actually just reading a book called The Club, which is kind of a history of the foundation and the history of the Premier League. Um, and they talk about Manchester City, Manchester City is owned by basically the royal family of
Yeah.
the one of the Emirates, and Manchester City was purchased because they wanted to tie their country into the Premier League, which is by some measures the most popular sports league in the world. And when people think of the Emirates, they want to think of our Manchester City, our championship soccer team that has won all these trophies. And so they poured a bunch of money into winning, and they've been able to become very, very successful in that end. And that's just an element of the game plan for these countries that have a lot of money, that are trying to diversify their portfolio. And one of the ways they're trying to do that is through tourism and people thinking nicely of them as opposed to thinking negatively about them. And there's some truth to a lot of the sense that people think negatively about the Middle East. They think the standard of living is low there. They think very negative things about the people there. And I'm sure a lot of them are based on negative stereotypes. And so there is a way of, we want people to think differently about us. And there's a truth to that difference about them. But I don't, it doesn't cover up how shameless it is. And that these are countries that, do not have good human rights records and are trying to convince you that everything's great there. And like anything, it's, there's a fine line between propaganda and advertising. And I think that a lot of these are trending towards the propaganda, and especially stuff like the WWE shows where trying to, everything's great. We love MBS. He's our favorite person.
And that just reminded me that Saudi Arabia, they're trying to buy Newcastle United and
they
trying
did
to do that same thing.
I mean, that's approved.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, it's already approved. And
right,
so exactly.
And Qatar owns PSG. We've seen it happen. In soccer. Haven't seen it in the US. I'd be very interested in seeing if that would fly in the United States for a sports league. It's a little bit, there's a lot of opposition to, the Saudi Arabia trying to buy Newcastle. That took years because there was, part of that was like a debate over, like, Saudi Arabia owns the people that want to buy Newcastle also owned a TV station that was like in a feud with the Premier League. So that's kind of a different thing, but it's one of those things that's going to continue to happen because these people have a lot of money and they have the ability to blow it on stuff like WWE shows because the people, the citizens, don't get to voice their displeasure. Like, and that's a whole other thing. It's like, is this a good use of taxpayers' money? Is giving Vince McMahon $100 million a year to run 2 wrestling shows there? I don't think so, but. I'm not a resident, and if you did, you wouldn't get to say really that you think it's a bad use of their money because it's not a media friendly environment, as we all learned when Jamal Khashoggi was murdered. But I think we'll wrap things up there. Appreciate everyone who's been listening. We'll see you guys again in a couple of weeks. I want everyone to be safe, and hopefully everyone's safe. Omicron looks to be turning down a little bit here, at least around Boston. I'm hoping that in a few more weeks, the case numbers continue to decline and we kind of burn through it. I hope everyone's been able to make through it okay. But I'm very much looking forward to the spring. I was thinking about that last week when it was like 0 degrees here, that I can't wait for it to be summertime. So take care, everybody. Hope everyone stays safe, and we will see you in early February.